Hi everyone. For my voice board over the Sound of Metal for this week's film, I have decided to do it over the idea of being disabled or disability because being disabled plays a huge part in the narrative of Ruben's journey in the Sound of Metal. So without further ado, this is the beauty of disability, fighting misfortune, or opinions. So, just before we get into the nitty gritty of my TED Talk, I just kind of want to provide a summary of The Sound of Metal. So, Sound of Metal tells the narrative of Ruben Stone, who is a drummer dealing with chronic hearing loss. Throughout The Sound of Metal, Ruben goes through a journey of learning about being deaf, being part of the deaf community, and potentially accepting his diagnosis of being deaf with the help of others in the deaf community. Although some scenes in the film appear to show Ruben finding his place among the deaf community, his ultimate decision distances himself from the connections he made along the way, which forces Ruben to confront his level of acceptance about being deaf. So, the first portion of the film that I thought was portrayed really well was learning to adapt. So, one major narrative told throughout The Sound of Metal is Ruben learning how to adapt due to chronic hearing loss that leaves him deaf. Ruben eventually ends up at a rehabilitation center that is made specifically for those who are hard of hearing or deaf. Through this rehabilitation center, Ruben learns sign language and other important skills to live in a world reliant on sound as a deaf person. The idea of adaptation is very common for many disabled people, just not those who are hard of hearing. For example, I am in a wheelchair. I've been in a wheelchair my whole life. And so I've had to adapt a lot in my 21 years of life, which I think it was so important to show in this movie because a lot of people may not know how much adaptation people with disabilities have to do. So the idea of adaptation is very common for many disabled people, including myself, since we live in a world that is only accessible for those who do not have any type of disability. Additionally, gaining a sense of community is also very important. So, a big part of the narrative throughout this film is Ruben learning about the deaf community while at the rehabilitation facility. Ruben begins volunteering quickly at a deaf school and spending time with people who are very proud to be in the deaf community. Through his experience at the rehabilitation facility and school, Ruben gains a sense of peace while gaining a sense of community. Having a sense of community, at least in my experience in the disabled community, really has a lot of benefits as you have other people who may be dealing with the same difficulties you are, which makes you feel less alone because sometimes it can be hard to be disabled because you feel like it's dirty or you're wrong, or sometimes it's just hard. And having others who share similar experiences with you is really helpful. And lastly, another topic that was talked about in this film is disability isn't a dirty word. One major theme discovered through the narrative of Sound of Metal is the discovery and discussion of the phrase disability isn't a dirty word. Joe even mentions this through the dialogue of this film to Ruben that the word disability isn't a dirty word when supporting Ruben in his journey of healing and acceptance. Joe is, I forgot to mention, the man in charge of the rehabilitation center that Ruben is at, dealing with his addiction and with his hearing loss. Growing up, I always heard disability isn't a dirty word or similar phrasing from my own family and social support. This constant reiteration for those that cared about me and loved me really made me feel that my disability isn't a negative subject or situation. It's really beautiful. It makes me who I am, and I'm proud to be disabled. I think one important thing that kind of is touched through the film and kind of in my own experience is society needs to, adapt this saying for people to hear the word that disability isn't dirty and that it's more something to be proud of. And I'm glad this film touched on it in such a sensitive and important matter because the more knowledge, the more power people have. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say other than disability is not a dirty word. So, in conclusion, disabled people learning how to adapt is very common. Having a sense of community, like what is depicted in The Sound of Metal, is very beneficial and welcoming for many disabled people. And disability is not a dirty word because we are human too, and we should be proud of all of our flaws and what makes us who we are. So, thank you for listening. Bye.